Here is Sailor Studio 773. This is a lighter orange in the writing sample, though the swatch shows it as being very red leaning as an orange. There is tone shift as papers change, but not a huge, and it does shade kind of to a red like what we see in the swatch. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs on par with the premium papers, making this a good ink for student note takers. This is not the type of orange I tend to go for. So for me, this is a hard pass, completely about the tone. I just don't see myself wanting or needing to ink this one up over other oranges.
The pen for today is a Sailor 1911 Large. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see really why I'm calling it a lighter orange. We get a lot of lighter tones in it. Now, this doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade very well. Take a look at sequence compared to compartments, third line to second line. A lot of very light tones, couple darker tones within. Same thing happens in compartments. Both of them look very nice, where different tends to just have a couple of darker letters. I think what we're getting is a matter of, is this the orange for you? Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor New York. Here is Sailor Maryland. Here is Sailor Kobe number 19, Minatagawa Lime. Here is Sailor Magic Purple.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is lighter than we have on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. I'm calling it lighter because the lightest tone that we got here compared to the Clairfontaine is noticeably lighter in it. I don't think this is a particularly good combination on this paper, but it might have done a little bit better with maybe a wetter or finer pen. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, we have no ghosting. I have a couple of spots that, I just see it a little bit deeper. It's really being nitpicky on it. Other than that, and the only reason it's being nitpicky is the comment of a wetter pen. I think a wetter pen might sort of backfire on the back of the page.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get very much the same tone as the Clairfontaine. This leads me to believe that this ink is a bit more opaque, not being affected by the tone of the paper underneath. It also appears a little bit more of a vibrant orange on this paper, perhaps a result of seeing the color contrast on the yellow versus a white paper. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It doesn't shade nearly like it did on any of the other papers. I kind of like the way I'm seeing it perform here, though. I have to say that. I think the lack of shading, not that it's not shading, but the much less shading is really working to its benefit here. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as what we saw on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against the quad rule with no kind of problem, making it a really good ink on these quad rule papers. That way the quad rule can melt into the background and not be distracting to what you've written. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with ghosting. None of the spots I'm circling bled through to touch the page underneath, but they are a bunch of spots that the ink got much deeper into the paper. Probably not going to stop you from writing back there, not so deep that it's really distracting, but deep enough that the moment I turn the page, I really got to see it.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more orange inks.
Here is Blackstone Wild Orange. Here is Noodler's Summer Tanager.
Here is Pannonia Copper.
Here is Pen BBS number 138.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Normally, this paper is going to make it a bit lighter and flatter, and it is not doing that here, really showing how strong this studio ink is for a student note taker. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade exactly the way it does on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at exactly on the second line where the E is a little bit lighter than the X. The AC do get a bit lighter than the T, very dark, slightly lighter Y, noticeably lighter L, much darker with the Y at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Mont Blanc Leo Tolstoy. Here is Platinum Brown. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green number 1.
Here is Van Diemen's Pepperberry. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a little bit darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. Feathering's not a problem here, though you could go out of your way to find just a couple tiny of them. It does spread, not hugely, but it does spread, normal amount of spread when dealing with copy paper, and it does have shading. Looking at the back of the page, not a problem for ghosting, not a problem for bleeding through to the page underneath, but it does show that little bit of inky aggression that's more a result of this paper than the ink. I don't think you could write back here.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow zoom nib of the Sailor 1911 large gives a medium tone orange that shades towards a red. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet medium, and it darkened to be red. That still shaded some, just sometimes down to a very red-leaning orange. I say the way to go here is a medium to dry flow pen in a standard fine, medium, or broad pen for the mid-tone orange that shades decent towards red.